Good morning to everybody at home and online. Just for those online, my name's Josephine Marsh and I'm the Acting State Archivist here at Queensland State Archives. Jingari Jumbalung. That's hello friends in the local Yugambeh language. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I walk, I work, I live, and I respectfully acknowledge their elders and ancestors. As the archives are a place for learning, I also respectfully recognise the continuing role of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as knowledge keepers in relation to their traditional country. So, welcome everyone. Queensland State Archives is partnering with Griffith University to host the 2022 Visiting Fellows Seminar Series. The seminars in this series will be presented by visiting fellows attached to the Harry Gentle Resource Centre of Griffith University. And it's a great opportunity to see how historians use QSA records to further their research. So to introduce our speaker today, Janis Hanley, I'd like to welcome the Director of the Harry Gentle Resource Centre, Professor Mark Fernane.
Thanks very much, Josephine, and welcome to you all and online to this talk, which is one of a continuing series that we have been hosting with Queensland State Archives over a number of years now. I'm Mark Fernane, Director of the Harry Gentle Resource Centre. The Resource Centre is a research centre of a different kind, established at Griffith University by bequest from a former student, Harry Gentle, a returned serviceman who in his later life went on to undertake a Bachelor of Arts degree, which he did history and became very interested in colonial history, and his will included a bequest to Griffith University to establish this centre interested in the collection of resources related to colonial history. So our centre is focused at this time and for the immediate future anyway on collecting resources and promoting research related to the history of all those who lived in Queensland in the earlier 19th century, in this period up to the point of separation from New South Wales. So it's quite unique in that respect. We do this work through sponsoring visiting fellowships, and that's been a very important part of our program. And the link with Queensland State Archives to enable people to talk about the research is highly valued by us. We also are engaged in a lot of work on the biography of early Queenslanders, and for that purpose we, over a number of years, have published the biographies of early Queenslanders, particularly through the work of Lee Butterworth, our research fellow who's with us here today. And currently we're developing a new online resource for biographies of early Queenslanders, and we're hoping to release that to the public later this year. That's been a major project. We think it'll produce a very rich resource for understanding early Queensland history. Our Visiting Fellows program involves support for mostly independent scholars, people who are not professionally employed in universities, but people who are engaged in independent scholarship in areas of interest to the centre. And Janis Hanley is one of those visiting fellows. Janis is a heritage consultant who, with a lot of experience across a range of heritage projects. She's also been turning her expertise into a qualification. She's just completed a PhD in this area, about to be awarded. So congratulations to Janis for that work. And her project that she's talking to today is one that we're very excited about, because if you think about early Queensland history, I mean, typically people would think about pastoralism and agriculture and rural industries. But of course, Queensland in the 19th century and for much of the 20th century was also a place that hosted significant industrial developments. And Janis, I think, is really the first fellow who's been looking at some aspect of the industrial history of Queensland in an area not very far from us and very important in Queensland's history. So the Ipswich Woollen mills are one of the industries that really was at the foundation of Ipswich richness as a community. And Janis wants to talk to us about some of the aspects of that history for the project she's been working on. Thanks, Janis.
Thanks everyone, and hello to everyone here and those online as well. I'd like to first acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we stand, elders past and present and future, and acknowledge that the land has never been ceded. I'd also like to acknowledge the custodians of a place called Tulma for many centuries, country of clans of the Yagara and Yugara language group in a place now called Ipswich. And I'd like to give my thanks to the Harry Gentle Centre and for their support in bringing this work together. My doctoral research was on the woolen mills, but it was at the end of the woolen mills, and I was interviewing former workers and that about the closure of the mills and what happened there and how it works. So this is a really interesting piece to put in, the really try to go back to the early origins, and it's not easy because there's not clear links. It's an industry that many don't know too much about, that Queensland even had a woolen industry and it ran for over 100 years here, so it's quite significant. Tulma became a penal outpost in 1827 and it was inhabited by a group of convicts and a supervisor. They had a job of digging up the limestone and burning it for the construction of buildings in Ipswich. So they were there for as long as until the penal colony closed up. So hence it became known as Limestone, Limestone Hills, Limestone Station. The town was renamed Ipswich by Governor Gipps in 1942 for reasons unknown. And some, didn't really want to accept the name change, but for others, it was they thought it was a way to dust off the convict image. Ipswich in England at the time was a busy port and a centre for woolen textiles, so perhaps for Gipps it was aspirational. Okay, so you can see down the bottom there's the limestone hills of Ipswich, circa 1895. I'm not sure what they look like originally. The ones above are the formations at Chillago, at Mareeba, and the top picture is the recently logged site in the 60s of where the woolen mills are about to happen. So there are three parts to today's talk. First is the becoming of Ipswich itself. The second is creating the Ipswich industries, the early industries forming. And finally, it's the becoming of the first woolen mill. There are a number of threads that become entangled, leading to the creation of mills. And you can have all the ideal conditions in the world, wool, coal, a river, but nothing happens unless, there's a desire for these things to come together. And so I have a look at that as we go through what are some of the hopes and dreams that started to bring these things together. So here's Ipswich. Oh, keep going the wrong way. So here's Ipswich today, thanks to Google Maps. So we see Ipswich CBD in the centre there. The former Queensland Woolen Manufacturing Company at North Ipswich, the first mill, is just across the river. You can see the little blue heart there. Across eventually was the Ipswich Woolen Company at East Ipswich, and then we had the Redbank, Morris's woolen mills at Redbank, further east. So we can see that Ipswich has got a population of 210,000 today, and it's rapidly growing. And the Woolen Mill at North Ipswich went on to be the largest employer of women in the 19th century and the early 20th century, so it's really important to women as well. So there we see the former Queensland Woolen Manufacturing Company on the terrace in Ipswich, at North Ipswich. So it looks pretty humble there, and it gives no idea of the size of the operations or what really happened there. It was heritage listed in 2008. When the mill opened, the brick building wasn't there. It wasn't there until 1890, so it started with a series of wooden buildings that were built by Mr. Crum at the cost of £450 on 7¼ acres of river frontage across from the CBD, costing £339. That was the start of the mill. Inside, it's quite startling when you walk in. It's quite a cavernous space. A lot obviously happened there, but it's also a little bit forlorn and sad with the puddles and the shadows and the graffiti, although there's some really excellent graffiti works there. So yarn itself, just to put you in the picture of what happened there, they'd start with wool off the sheep's back like this that we have here. This is from the saddle. The sheep's name was Softly, by the way. This is the wool in the raw, so it's got bits of fibre and dust and dirt and urine and faeces in some parts. Not this part, that one's fine, it's from the saddle. And then it gets processed and combed. And this one I've combed out a little. You can see this is where the wool was attached to the sheep. And we can see that the yarn is just a series of fine fibres. That's the length of the individual fibres. And wool's nature, it has a propensity to cling to each other. It's very sticky. It's got these little tiny hooks on the outside. And that gives it the property to be able to drawn out, stick together and spun. And so from this can be spun, and it's tough and strong. So that's the process. And I want to give a shout out to the Ipswich spinners and weavers who took the patience to teach me how to do this. And it gave me good insights to what the machinery had to do, because hands can do this fairly easily, but to give it to machinery, once technology takes it, it's very tricky, and it takes a series of machines in the process. But what the mechanisation does, of course, is give volume and speed. And that meant the woolen mills in England, as the technology became better and better, they were more and more voracious for wool, and hence the beauty of stumbling across a place like Australia that was ready with pastures. So, the opening of the mill in 1877 was a red letter day for Ipswich, and it was a major, major event. And looking at the building, you wouldn't think that, but the governor came to open it, the premier was there, a couple of his ministers there, and it was declared a public holiday. They had half-price train fares for people to get there. So to mark their sense of its importance, the day was almost universally kept as a strict holiday. All the shops were shut, flags were floating, and many buildings. So it was a big day. And there's unfortunately no photos of that day. But we do have a photo of the opening of the first railway line from Ipswich to Granchester that was taken 10 years before. And you can see the crinoline and the top hats and the marquee there. And, you know, I'm interested in the flags across the top and wonder what they represent. But it was big. It was as big as this. It was the biggest thing that had happened in Ipswich. So we can see Ipswich in terms of Moreton Bay, which was the area up until the base of the mountain. So Ipswich is nicely positioned in the centre. It had At that stage, when they were first there, the Great Dividing Range seemed impenetrable right here, and the Darling Downs, they weren't quite sure what was there. There was a 50-kilometre exclusion zone around the colony, so it meant that not a lot happened there, and you needed a permit to actually be there or approach. So that kind of held things up a bit in terms of Ipswich happening. Dixon's map, you can see Stradbroke Island there, and it's the passage there where goods came through the South Passage on its way to Brisbane and then up the river to Limestone. You can see the river more closely here as it goes from Brisbane along the Brisbane River, lots of twists and turns, and then here. So it was the head of river navigation, so an ideal point for bales of wool to be shipped down the river, and much easier than taking it by drays. And of course, early in the piece, we have Cunningham arriving on the scenes, and he came up through the western side of the Dividing Range. So he entered the Darling Downs around Texas, and he was amazed, and that his quote shows his amazement. "You may discover another Australia, but you'll never discover another Darling Downs." So he was so bowled over. I mean, that's a big statement to make, isn't it? And so he went back the way he came. He climbed a mountain on the range, saw something that he thought might be a gap that turned out to be good, and he came back the next year by ship and came in from Moreton Bay side and found Cunningham's Gap. So that was the start of things. So we've set the scene. We've got the beginning threads. We've got a navigable Brisbane River connection. We've got a limestone mini industry. We've got Logan noticed some coal seams around the limestone works. We've got pristine grazing lands on the ranges and a possible gap through. So the scene was set. And here we have George Thorne, who is in Sydney. In 39, everyone knew the colony was about to close, so he thought there'd be opportunities there. And cleverly, he decided to take a position, a cut in pay, to take a position to oversee the colony's pastures, and he was situated at Limestone. So here he was, 39, came up from Sydney with his wife Jane of 18. They went together by punt up the Brisbane and then the Bremer River to a little cottage and some huts in the middle of nowhere. And they had a little baby just born. So I'm not sure who was braver, George or Jane at that point. It was a pretty remarkable thing to take on. One of his descendants, Thorne, wrote a book that his workers would be criminals under sentence, and it seemed that Aborigines in the district were troublesome, prone to petty theft and, more worryingly, occasional violence. For all this, his wage would be substantially less. But on the other hand, he was confident that he could do the job and been told the opening of Moreton Bay. He had seen how others had succeeded by grasping the opportunities that this new land offered, and he did. Meanwhile, so we've had 11 years since Cunningham came through, so finally some squatters get to the plains, and it's the Leslie brothers and Tinker Campbell, who had a property near there. He joined them, and Arthur Hodgson were the first ones there to set up pastures. So we've started to get action on the mills, and we're starting to get those sheep happening. So we've got George and Jane Thorne there in Limestone. We've got the squatters there, and Thorne first met the squatters when they came through to get supplies from Brisbane and to check out about the wool. And it's exactly what George had been hoping for. So he offered his hospitality of his cottage to the passing squatters, and in the end he applied to the government, can I actually use one of the sheds here for supplies to set up a shop, and can I offer them accommodation? And they said yes. So he had a good 3 years of providing this hospitality to the early squatters, and it gave him the capital to be able to set up a pub when Ipswich first opened. So the opportunity for Jane and George was enormous. So he was also able to be on the spot when the surveyors were coming through, like Wade came through in 43 to set up the blocks of land in Ipswich. So this is the first map of the proposed Ipswich settlements, was still called limestone then. But Thorne was able to tell them where it flooded because he'd been through 2 major floods, and he knew the lie of the land and he knew exactly the best places. So, and it also meant he was in the position to buy the first lots too. So very advantageous there. And there we have, a year later, the allotments went on sale for the town of Ipswich and Brisbane at the same time. And we can see there in the middle of this 1860s image, we've got Thorne's first pub. And of course there was a steady stream of squatters coming through, and he prospered and went on. So that's the beginning stuff happening here. So we've got the scene set. But this next part, we have a look at what industries were happening. So we've got the river transport corridor, we've got coal and abundance of wool coming through Ipswich. You can see Barlow extolling the virtues that never had he seen such a place where there's so many facilities combined together for such a thing as the mills. But there were problems. The squatters, they'd been there 3 years, their stock was really fat, they had nowhere to take them. They could take them back to Sydney for processing, but it was drought, the stock would never make it. So they talked Tinker Campbell into setting up a meat curing works and a boiling down establishment at Kangaroo Point. It didn't go so well, but then he relocated to Redbank, so there are a few issues, but it's really our first start at processing locally these animals for export. You can see an example of a boiling down works. That's one up at Charleville there. Not a pleasant task, I don't think. So it all expanded pretty quickly. So 2 years later, if you have a look at all the little S's on the map there, you see these are all squatters' runs taken up. So in 2 years, we had them coming over the range and settling in and around Ipswich and Brisbane. So more safer ways were found down from the ranges, Gorman's and Spicer's Gap. Cunningham's Gap was very difficult for drays, and a few were lost going up there, so they're always on the hunt for safer ways through. And then we can see there that Cleveland was starting to be seen as an easier route through for the wool. So again, it would come through Ipswich still, which was pretty key, bypass Brisbane, and it was a quicker way because they didn't have to go through this last bit of reach and along the coast to here, because the South Passage was the way to Sydney initially. And a lot of the squatters preferred that, but in the end, they had to take the Northern Passage because it up here through, which made the Brisbane River advantageous and Brisbane, so that this was too troublesome. In 1846, the port of Moreton Bay was defined, and the first paddle steamer made its way to Ipswich, so we've got fast transport happening. Before that it was punts. But the Bremer River was both friend and foe. So it brought incoming goods, it was able to take bales of wool down, but it also flooded. And we can see here that particularly if we have a look at the flood maps over the last 100 years, there's a lot of major floods happen there in Ipswich. A lot of times it goes over the red line, and this has continued to be problematic for Ipswich. So 49, we had Benjamin Cribb arriving and setting up his stores, the London stores. He brought a suitcase full of goods, got off at the wharf of Ipswich, landed and set up his first store, and it went on. He eventually formed a partnership with Foote, who was also his brother-in-law, and they formed Cribb and Foote, which lasted until 1977. So it was a very long business running, and as soon as you got business, he had no bank at start. He had to send his stuff by horseback to Brisbane, the banks in Brisbane, so it took a few years to get a bank happening. So we start to get some of the services happening that support business to occur. So by the end of 1859, there were 3 banks in Ipswich, 5 churches, a temporary school of arts, a hospital and a surgeon. So we're starting to see the infrastructure needed. We also had the early industrial villages just outside Ipswich, of Town Marie and the Bremer Mills. So these are now archaeological sites. There's nothing much left of them, but they were a hive of activity. So there were a couple of hundred people living at the Bremer Mills sites. There was a school, a shop. Richard Smith started up the Town Marie site on one side of the river. There was a sawmill, boiling down works, wharf with crane, houses, cottages, and it was a going concern. Similarly, the Bremer Mills, but the Bremer had a flour mill, so he was processing wheat that he traded for timber from his sawmills. And it all was humming along until the 57 floods, and then it got wiped out. So they tried to recover and did so, but it never came together. So then we have Richard Ivory coming on the scene in the late 1860s, who purchased both the estates, but he was more an agriculturalist, so he was growing things rather than carrying on the industries as such. But most of the industries that happened in Ipswich at that stage, in the 40s and 50s, as it got established, were to support the local population in housing and food. So there wasn't much industry that looked beyond its own needs and look to other pursuits that would actually form a more stable economy for the town of Ipswich. John Campbell writes of the efforts of Joseph Fleming at the Bremer Mills, that few men in Queensland have contributed more to its early settlement than Joseph Fleming, a member of the first Parliament, and at that time one of the largest employers of labour and capital in it, so he was quite significant. And of course we have coal, and I don't have to say too much about coal. There's a lot of people that research coal, and it's much written about, but the first known coal mine in Ipswich was opened in 1843, at Red Bank, and then in Ipswich in 1846. But it really took off when there were industries. The coal was first needed just for the steamboats, but once the railways came online, there was a real demand for the coal. And this is when Lewis Thomas became the king of coal. It was just money for jam, digging up coal and giving it to the railways. He has an interesting connection to the mills too. He comes from a little mill town in Wales called Talybont, and his nephew arrived ready to join him in the coal industry, but he convinced him instead that, this is a good place to start a mill. And so he did, and that was John Morris. And John Morris found a couple of investors, and off they went and established the East Ipswich Mills. But that wasn't until 1911 that happened. So that's still got a way to come. And of course we have separation in 59, and we know that Brisbane became the capital. It beat the others in the running. And what it meant for Ipswich was it had to really define itself. It had to find its reason for being and define who it was. And a year later, Ipswich became a municipality, so it got its first council, and it didn't build a city hall, it just extended the arts, School of Arts buildings. But what's interesting is in its first year, the next year, council was totally broke, but the mayor decided that it needed a seal to define itself. And it's kind of a marketing tool if you look at it. And what's really interesting is that it's got the industry here, the mills. Well, the mills aren't there yet. It's got this industry here, and there wasn't much there at that time. So I'm not sure how much of that was aspirational, or to say we can do this, is to attract the interest of others to come to Ipswich because it's got the river, it's got the coal, it's got the sheep, it's got everything you could need. And we see the population there. It's still a little town. It's only 3,500 people at that stage. Brisbane is double, but we've got a big population there in the whole of Queensland happening. And we see Ipswich's population going up.
What does the Latin mean? Do you know?
I did, but I don't know now. It's something we move ahead with confidence.
Yeah, it'll be
Yeah, it was about confidence.
Yeah.
And I think that's what this was about. It was a bit of a smoke and mirrors thing. Well, you know, there was certainly some, you know, there was a lot. There was the wool and everything there, but the industry was more an idea of what they could be. And of course, the big turning point for Ipswich in terms of industrialisation was the railway workshops, and they started up in 1863. And this location's actually on the Bremer River. So if you've been to Ipswich, there's Riverlink is their main shopping centre in the middle of town. It was around about there, I'm told, that the railway workshop's there. And it's not too far. It's on the same side of the river as where the mill would eventuate. So it brought prosperity and jobs with it. And it was a big deal, obviously. And it started to, I think it was part of that confidence building that we can do something like this. We can start to build railways for the whole of Queensland. We can do other things too. And the last link in this is the war and cotton part of it. So we've got the US Civil War happening in 1861 and 1865, and Ipswich had been experimenting with growing cotton there, but it was only with the they found they couldn't compete basically with the slave labour in the US. So what the Civil War did was give them an opportunity to get to market, it was proved beneficial. We had the Ipswich Ipswich Cotton Company come online, and we had Cribb and Foote getting involved, and Cribb and Foote and Harris set up cotton ginning. So we've got that industry, and they were steam-run cotton gins. So we've got the beginnings of processing textiles. This is the first time we've done something with the textile rather than the beast or the plant. So it's got quite a history. And the government stepped in, and they were actually subsidising cotton for the first little while from when the Civil War ended. The Queensland government subsidised cotton, so the growers got £10 a bale. Seems very generous. And then that went for 3 years. So it bolstered up the cotton industry. But but it wasn't quite enough. It ran for another decade, but just kind of slowly petered out. So it was quite good while it lasted, but it wasn't the answer for Ipswich. And it wasn't quite the right climate for cotton either. So we didn't actually see a cotton mill in Ipswich till the 1890s. And it was, by that stage, Cribb had died, and the mill started up. And what's interesting particularly about this mill is that it was the first, 11 years later, this is where John Morris actually started his woolen mill. So they got rid of the cotton processing equipment and retooled it for wool. So we can see the connections happening there with the textiles. So we're now at the final part to the mills actually happening. We've got the stage set again. We've got cotton. We knew we could do cotton. We've got that growing. We've had a few economics ups and downs, but Ipswich has kept growing, albeit at a smaller pace than its sister city, Brisbane, and possibly tapered off more as the north opened up and people found fresh grounds there. So here we see where we're at here in terms of population. In the mid-1870s, we're up around 8,000. We can see Queensland running away, Ipswich, the grey line at the bottom. So it kind of keeps on going steadily compared to the other places. So that's the patterns population-wise. Interesting, around the country, we've got other woolen mills coming online in that time. So in New South Wales in 1861, we've got the Parramatta mills coming online, Bowenfels mills in the Blue Mountains, the Victoria Woolen and Cloth Manufacturing coming online in 1868 in Geelong. We've got South Australia Loberthal mills, which went on to become Onkaparinga. Got an Onkaparinga blanket on my bed. And then in 1874, we've got Waverley mills coming online in Launceston. And it's still operating amazingly. So it's the only one of these big old mills left, or any mills left. There's a few new start-offs, but it's over, basically, for those big old industries. So in 1874, we have a prospectus go out to form these new mills. So it was a public company forming, asking for subscribers. So this wasn't someone with experience or a family business starting a mill like the Morrises. This was, it's a good idea to have a mill. We've got government subsidies happening to start one. Let's do it. Let's get Ipswich on the map. It's really important for Ipswich. And so the people involved are interesting. So you can see that in the prospectus on the Provisional Board of Directors, we've got the Premier, we've got former Premiers, we've got George Thorne Jr., who is now MLC, and we've got a whole lot of people whose stories haven't survived the 100 years and little is known about other than their name. But the real drivers that we've got here are McFarlane and Ginn. So they were the workhorses of getting this off the ground. So there was some practical men amongst the provisional directors, and they put their whole energy into the work, especially their secretary, Mr. Ginn, who put his whole soul into the matter. This was his baby, and John McFarlane, who was a draper, was beside him. So McFarlane, we see he's the one, at least he knew something about textiles, being a draper, so he knew about the different fabrics, the serge and the twills and the tweeds. And he was the one who was sent down to the mills down south that we've just seen to find out what is it we need, how much money do we need to start this company, give us a list of machinery and equipment and where we get it from. So he went to Bowenfels, he went to Geelong, and he ended up with his list. There were some delays, curiously, because of a break in the telegraph line across to London in ordering the equipment. So things didn't go quite as quickly as they'd like. Gin, I don't have a photo of, but there is his cottage on the heritage list in Ipswich. So he was the secretary. When I grabbed all the newspaper articles together and I did searches, Gins was the name that came up the first, second was McFarlane. It's interesting these relative unknowns come onto the scene to get this mill happening. The other thing to keep in mind is the directors weren't paid. So it took 3 years from the provisional, the prospectus going out to set up the mill, but the decision was that no director was to receive any money until the first dividend. So it's a big ask of those who were the main drivers to, if they had other businesses and whatever else happening. So this here is the first provisional board. So we see John and William Gin and James Riley and Samuel Hodgson. So remember there was a Hodgson squatter up on the Downs early days. I haven't found if they're connected, but it seems they might be, doesn't it? So there's an interesting quote here. They all were novices, and a gentleman had remarked to him the other day, there was not a practical man amongst them so far as their knowledge of woolen manufacture was concerned. Their principal object from the very outset was to avoid taking a false step, and for this reason they'd sent Mr. McFarlane to Melbourne to get all the information he could as to the machinery. So that's Gin speaking there, being quite open and honest about their lack of knowledge. So, one thing that did get them going was the Queensland Government manufacturing incentives that happened. So the Queensland Government, they're a new colony, they think we need industry, what are we going to do to get something happening? So there was the Native Industries Bill in 1869, an interesting name. It basically, the deal was they'd get £1,000 for the first 5,000 yards of wool they'd manufactured, and they'd get 1,000 acres. So the cash £1,000, and they worked out that the land would be worth about £3,000, the 1,000 acres. So they're all very excited about that, and it wasn't something that went in people's pockets, but it was certainly a big enabler. It got them thinking about developing a business, and it was a bit of a guarantee that if things don't go well, you have got this money coming to you. There was lots of discussions in Parliament about it. So that basically the idea was promoting the general prosperity of the colony, that there was in this colony a great desire, great want of manufacturers, and there was a scarcity of a manufacturing industry that was able to give employment to the large numbers, the growing population. And there was quite a discussion in Parliament about the pros and cons that are interesting because it gives us more insight into why they were doing it. So the amount of woolen importations coming in of finished goods was raised. There was England had given incentives to its early industry, and Victoria offered £5,000 to its mill. It was a bit more generous up front. And the Premier wanted opportunities for the rising youth. They were getting lots of babies born. And also they wanted the inducement for people to immigrate here, and they wanted people to come to Ipswich. And also, why not give it to the woolen industry? Because they were giving rewards to finding gold, and one would think that gold was its own reward, but anyway. So the bill passed. There was much discussion. They basically tweaked a bit to give more incentives for cotton because they thought that was a more difficult industry. I'm not sure that it is. And they wanted to make sure that people didn't fake it. They didn't produce low quality stuff to get the incentives. So what do we know about the desires of the first board? Did this match up to what the expectations of the government was? What were their own desires? So McFarlane gives a lovely speech about importing skilled workers, and then that they'll come in addition to the population, and they must be housed. And then they must not only have somewhere to live, but something to live on. So he gives this whole chain of prosperity for Ipswich with large numbers of workers coming in. And they would probably make a lot of money, was his optimistic view, that all too soon, it wouldn't be long before they were building a cotton mill next door to the woolen mill. And then, even more, instead of importing machines, they'd be building the machines and selling them. So he saw the whole end game, the whole economic imperative for the woolen mills. And he thought that more would come. And what are the shareholders? Now, I find the shareholders really interesting. There were 10,000 shares and 500 to 600 shareholders, and we don't know who they were because those records aren't kept, unfortunately. I was hoping they might be. They were mostly in Ipswich. Now, that's really interesting. It wasn't the squatters investing, it was the locals in Ipswich. And it sort of stands to reason. The squatters had a market for their wool. It was easy. They had the system. They just transported the wool off their property, and then it went to England, and they were getting good prices for it. And they didn't really have to, a secondary industry didn't really mean a lot to them because they were sitting pretty. They had more money than they could know what to do with. They weren't all that interested in investing. So it seemed to be the Ipswich people themselves got behind it because they could see that it would mean a lot for Ipswich. And I think McFarlane there, he's quite lovely in how he talks about these shareholders, that the man who held his 5 or 10 shares was equally as necessary as he who held his 50. And by depending on one another, the chain which bound them together became all the stronger. So he's really community-minded, and he's got his eye on the ball that this is the local community that's supporting us here. And that he talks about working harmoniously together. If only they pull harmoniously together, they will be a success. So on opening day, we start to get the views with the speech of Sir Edward Kennedy at the Arthur Edward Kennedy on the opening day. And he starts in an interesting way because there was a prevailing narrative in the colonies that we couldn't do this. So he's saying that who knew that we could make blankets and broadcloth, that it could be produced outside England, but they'd just been given a tour of the mills, and he's going, well, obviously we can. And sort of there was other evidence in other states that they could as well. But the origins of this come back to the 1819 big report to Parliament that said that when he looked into it, he clearly stated that the manufacturing of wool in the colony is not an object that is much to be desired. That's by England, of course, because they needed all the wool they could get to feed their mills. and they didn't want any competition. So you just stick to growing the wool, we'll look after the manufacturing, was basically the message. And I think it put us behind because it was then another 50 years before we got started properly on that industry. And by that stage, the English manufacturing was well established, so it really put us behind. He went on to say that wool was a patriotic duty, that, and we ought to be ashamed to wear imported clothes, that it was our patriotic duty to actually dress in locally made goods. And local jobs too were his thing. So of course they're back to all this youth that they're worried about not having anything to do, and the prospect of their boys and girls who are growing up around them without anything to do, no gainful employment to be had. And finally we hear of the governor's own desires, about the example they were setting here, the people of Ipswich for the rest of the Queensland colony, that they were the means of inducing capitalists to come to the colony and bringing skilled labour and other useful classes of immigrants. They're very keen at the time to spread their tax base. It's expensive setting up a colony and you need as many in the population as possible that can bear that load. So, I mean, these are good things for growth, but it's interesting the different takes different people had about why these things are important. And so in conclusion, I started this journey looking into the threads that made a compelling story for the first woolen mill of Ipswich. And all the ingredients were there, but it didn't quite gel together. The same people didn't necessarily carry on. And it was more like our bits of wool, that it's just this series of broken threads that somehow join together and we get an industry out of the end of it. Just because they had the resources didn't mean it would necessarily happen. But it was easy to assume they would, but the separation of Queensland would certainly help them realise what they needed to do as a colony. There was early on confidence with growing small concerns starting up, but the railway workshops were a major undertaking that helped them take further steps. I looked under many rocks in the process of trying to find the thread of continuity, and it was frustrating. But because there isn't really, but it happened anyway, and that's how things happen. That's how life happens and how history happens. And the mills themselves, they were easy. The easy industries are the ones, the sawmills, the making bricks that people obviously see they need. But something like a mill is very foreign to what they know. One thing I realised about the story was the government intervention, and that stayed with us. And really the mills were supported by government help in all sorts of forms. And what you see there, the picture from the State Archive, is a bond. The mill really struggled in its early years and they couldn't pay dividends because whilst they calculated the capital to start up the mill correctly, they didn't realise how much working capital they'd need. And that was mainly because they couldn't sell their product. There wasn't a market for the product, not a ready market. And it was possibly a little naive. They were so intent on getting this mill set up and it took all their energy. They hadn't been thinking about the practicalities of how this was going to be sold. And in England it was easy because they'd been doing wool textiles for centuries and they had the guilds and they had the merchants set up. It was all there. So when mechanisation happened, apart from the protests of course, the market was there. That was never an issue. The issue was the raw materials, really. That's, you know, Australia's so generously provided. So the Queensland government helped out with contracts, and they never stopped helping the mills with giving contracts for uniforms and upholstery and blankets and whatever else. As well as that, there were tariffs. Once the Australian government came online, it was a protected industry. So it's interesting, it sparked my interest that McFarlane spoke about in the first year they sent samples to Japan and Hong Kong of the mill, of what they made. And I couldn't help thinking, what would have happened if they'd actually followed that up and they'd actually created those trading relationships with those countries? What would have happened next? So that's it. I'll leave it there. I hope you've found the story interesting, and so I'm open to any questions.
Thank you, Janis. I enjoyed that very much, including all the maps and the geography and so on. In relation to the project I've been working on, I get it. I'm interested in T.B. Stevens.
Yes.
And I'm wondering who I don't know in what year, but I think very late 1840s, 1850s, has a wool scour at Ormiston. So that ties in with,
at Ormiston,
at Ormiston.
At Eckerburn.
He's then at Eckerburn. He's buying in the 1850s.
Yes.
But if I think about this mob, having the wool from the Darling Downs and then wanting to turn it into thread, you'd think that the wool scours would have been there.
Yes.
In your excellent geographic understanding, can you understand why T.B. Stevens would have been called to Eckerburn?
No. I mean, there were the wharves in Brisbane where it came into before it went on its way across the ocean. So he would have gotten his supply of wool from, the Brisbane wharves probably. But there's no reason it couldn't have happened in Ipswich. I just haven't found a wool scour, but
I mean,
until the mill started, they scoured their own wool, but not before that.
Yes. Okay. So they have their own scour. So it's probably part of the competition back and forth. But anyway, terrific presentation.
Thanks. The wool scouring didn't start up properly as its own industry until the 20th century up at central Queensland. They saw the value of a secondary industry when they weren't shearing and stuff.
Thomas Blackett Stevens had the one, mentioned before at Ormiston, and it was only when the Brisbane River was dredged at the mouth and they put a trench through that decent-sized ships could go, and therefore Cleveland didn't become the port, Brisbane did. He opened up at Eckerburn because he owned land there, and he'd purchased that, actually some of it prior to coming to Brisbane.
Yeah.
With the partnership of Atkinson, he did establish a wool scour and fellmongery in the Brimmer River at the junction of the Brisbane.
So that was Stevens at the...
Thomas Blackett Stevens was a partner of Atkinson.
Oh, okay. All right. So I didn't come across that, but thank you. I'll follow that up. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much, Janis. The way you finish makes it a bit of a metaphor for the fate of Australian secondary industries. It was always more profitable, it seems, to produce wool and export it. And I wonder about the scale of what's involved. I mean, the wool industry was so profitable at different parts of the 19th century versus the tremendous investment you need here, and then questions of labour and so on, relative to the advantages of
just shipping
Australia.
It off. Yeah. Well, even at its height, when there were 100 mills around Australia, so that was the height of our woolen textile manufacturing, they were using less than 5% of the clip. So they were never going, well, they could have if they'd had a huge export industry like England did. If they ever developed the market similarly, they could have, because they certainly had everything else. But there was just this hesitation with secondary industry, and I never understood when we had such good resources why we just didn't actually run with it. But it does take, it's risky. And then by the time synthetics came, it was, all over. It was just not. And especially then we shipped our mills to developing countries and let them have all the environmental problems and the low wages and all of that. So it's not written about, but when the mill closed, it was the time where it was the women's wages became, apparently, when it was the equal wage, which meant before that they were, from the 50s on, they were just, of course, as you know, only earning 3/4 of what the men's salaries were. And that would be a big hit to these largely female workforces, to the profitability of a mill, and they all started going under then. So, that's another factor. Yeah. Yeah.
So we've got a question online from Henry Rees. He said, "Thanks for a fascinating presentation. I'm wondering how the mill was powered. Did they have good connections with local coal manufacturers, or later on did they use electricity?"
Yes, good question. And it was coal powered at the start, so they had big boilers and an engine, and you can see the remnants of the where the boilers were on site. And where the furnaces were. So they were self-sufficient energy-wise until electricity came on board, and they had the river. So it meant they pumped all the water they needed from the river. They didn't need town water supply. They pumped, of course, all the waste back in the river. It was only the Morris mills that, because it was later and their environmental regulations came in, they had to start worrying about settling ponds and not just dumping things in the river. So they were really well resourced and needed to be next to a river because of those very things. So for the steam tanks, they got the water from the river. They got the water for washing the wool. They had it all really there.
Thanks, Janis. That was fantastic. And I was just wondering about the state of the site these days. You showed some photos with the excellent graffiti inside, and I wondered whether there's any plans to do anything, and perhaps any kind of displays or any kind of restoration with the site.
Good you asked. I've been working with an artist in Rhode Island to set up an exhibition in the mills. And she applied for a Fulbright scholarship to come out and put that together, and she got through all the US peer review, but we didn't make it through the choice of Australian government end, but we're seeking different funding. We're keeping on seeking funding in that. Ipswich Council has put a lot into the mill already. They've spent several $1 million in the conservation of the mill. One of the problems is it's under the planning scheme, the structures aren't, it hasn't been set up under the planning scheme for people to be there. It's set up as a warehouse, and they had to do significant structural work in order to change its use to have a different use that has people in it. And they've spent a few $1 million already, and I think the last article I read, it was up to $10 million, the conservation work needed. So they want to do it, but, they need a partner, someone who's interested and has a use for the site that can sustain that sort of investment in the site. So I'm chipping away just doing little things like, exhibitions and finding out its story.
Thank you, Janis, for that fascinating talk. It really struck me listening to that, the similarities to what's happening today with Ipswich and the pride that people have in Ipswich, and, the new mayor that's come in and is trying to, get investment and everything in the city. It's exactly the same that the people you were talking about there, and the incentives and the pride in the city. So that was really, really fascinating and a great opportunity to hear you sharing your research with us and everybody online as well. So thank you to everybody for attending today. Thank you to everybody online for watching. Thank you particularly to Janis and to Mark for pulling this all together, and to Alicia for pulling together this at Queensland State Archives. But we look very much forward to bringing another QSA talk to you soon. So thank you very much.